Hello everyone, this is Jotto and welcome to another edition of the Hearthstone Weekly Show. Now this is actually a different weekly because the other two top 5s I did this weekend were the overhyped, underhyped, etc, etc. Now this particular video is going to be the top 5 classes for ladder climbing. Yes, I'm not tackling tournaments, I'm not that well versed on the current tournament metagame. However, as for laddering, season is coming to an end. The first proper GVG season, starts in a couple of days. I think it's about 5 days from now, 4? It's something around there, but anyway. So, I've compiled top 5. Now, first things first, most classes are viable for laddering. In fact, I would go to say that all of them are. I think every single class is very viable laddering right now. I think the weakest is Shaman. I think. It's difficult. So, Shaman, I think, is the weakest. The strongest I have gone at a limb and saying, and we'll see in the actual list, but I do think Shaman is the weakest, but I'm pretty sure all the classes are viable. You can take them all to Legend, you can get really high ranks with them, so the game is pretty well balanced in terms of classes right now, as far as all of them being viable. But anyway, let's start with the actual top 5. Now, at number 5, I have Priest. Now, no, I'm not doing decks. Now, the reason I'm not doing decks is because there's about 15 variants of each of these classes, and I'm not going to be bothered with going over every single one because that would be a 3-hour long video. So, that's why I'm not doing decks. Now, I will be doing deck techs for the rest of the week. I'm doing a Rogue one, possibly a Paladin one, and we'll see from there. But as for Priest is number 5. Now, there's a couple variants of Priest that have all been fairly useful. There's been the Mech Priest, almost said Mech Mage. There's been the Mech Priest, which we've actually seen on Versus Series 2 weeks ago, which is quite powerful, however it's a bit clunky. Then there's the couple different types of Control Priests, there's the traditional ones with Wild Pyromancer and Double Cabal, and then there's all the Shrinkmeister combos you can do with that, and Vojin for controlling, and it works out pretty well. And then there's this third type, which is kind of an old one holding on at the moment, which Zetalot has been playing, which is Death Rattle Priest. This actually surprised me a lot, but Zetalot has got to top 10 legend for the last couple of days with Death Rattle Priest. It's quite interesting, actually, and I'll link that particular deck in the description if I can go ahead and find it. I think I should be able to, and then I'll link that one in the description in case anyone's wondering, because I actually think Death Rattle Priest is kind of interesting. And obviously it's performing well if you can get it top 10 legend. But anyway, so Priest takes number 5. It's got some good matchups against the rest of the good decks in the metagame. All the aggro decks it's actually quite good against. And it's fairly decent against some of the slower decks. Not fantastic, but fairly decent. Although, if you want to play Priest against a slow deck, you have some dedication, because I cannot sit down to play 30-minute games of Hearthstone. I just can't. But anyway, so Priest takes number 5. Now, the top 4 gets a bit sketchy. So, and when I say sketchy, I mean it's difficult to arrange them. So, we're going with Mage at number 4. Now, Mech Mage being the main one here, although there has been Freeze Mage as well. Freeze Mage is, for some reason, quite good. It makes very little sense. Freeze Mage has had so many instances where it was supposed to completely die off, and it just never does. It just sticks around, and it's actually a decent deck right now, to the point where in tournaments some people are banning it because they just don't want to play against it, which is fair enough. It has some weird matchups, and it actually turns out that the matchups have completely flipped because there's the flare nerf, so hunters aren't just steamrolling them anymore. And also, the way that the metagame is shaped out, it's a lot more minion-centric, as in minions on the board control the board, so the board wipes are much more effective, and so are the freezes, because there's way less charge than there has been in the past right now. So as a result, Freeze Mage got better. Now, as for Mech Mage, which I personally think is the better mech deck, is the better mech deck in the entire format right now. There's a couple roaming around. There's a Druid one, there's the Priest one, and then there's the Mage one being the 3 predominant. And then there's a random rogue one. But I think Mech Mage is the strongest of the mech decks, and I also think it's the strongest of the mage decks. Some people will disagree with me on that one, but I actually think it is the strongest of the mage decks. I've tried out a lot of Mage, although, like, as some of you may know if you've watched me streaming, Ragnaros hates me. I never get rag hits, but Goblin Blast Mage I never miss with. So that may have a slight slight effect on how strong I think that deck is if your Blast Mages never miss. But yeah, Blast Mage is actually a crazy card. It's one of the reasons to play Mage right now, along with the standard like Water Elemental, Fireballs, Flame Strikes, things like that. Flame Strike less so, but Water Elemental, Fireballs, there's Golden Blast Mage. Unstable Portal has made a massive splash in a lot of different decks. Some people run it in mech, some people don't. It's a case of it's like if you don't like unpredictability, you don't run it. But then if you're fine with unpredictability, you do run it because the card is super powerful. So there's a lot of different reasons to run Mage right now, and I think the Mech Mage is probably the best because it just controls the board and then tempos them to death. It's an absolute tempo deck. It just controls the board and tempos them to death, and then you just burn them out with Fireballs. It's the most tempo deck in the entire format, which is funny because it's a deck called Tempo Rogue. So yeah, it is in fact the most tempo-centric deck in the format, and I think it's actually quite powerful. But anyway, so Mage takes number 4. Now, the top 3 took me a while to figure out which order I was going to put these in, and depending on who you ask, they're going to rearrange these 3, although I would not be surprised if these 3 took the top 3 places in pretty much every list. Warrior. Now, Control Warrior, and only Control Warrior when I say Warrior. Control Warrior is one of the single strongest decks in the entire format. Very, very good against Freeze Mage, which is relevant from time to time. Less so on ladder. There's not that many Freeze Mages. You don't run into them very often. But it's also very good against Hunter. Hunter has been popping up a lot, actually. It's not it's not one of the best classes, but as I said, all classes are viable, so you could argue for it, and it is fairly popular that Rush, Hunter, and Warrior functions very well against it. It's good against pretty much all the aggro decks. Good against Mech Mage, which is important. So being good against Mage is quite important, and Warrior's worst matchup is Shaman. Now, Shaman is the worst class in the game right now, I think. It's between Shaman and Rogue. I think Shaman is, because Rogue did recently get rank 1 legend on EU, and it's been popping up a lot more in tournaments as well and on ladder as just these tempo variants. And Rogue was more of a case of it died off because no one really knew what they were doing with it because Gadgetzan got nerfed, and for the last 6, 7, 8 months, Gadgetzan and Rogue have been the same thing. So Rogue died off because of that as opposed to the class being bad. And Warrior is very good against Rogue, which is coming back. It's good against Hunter, which is quite popular. It's good against all the aggro decks, which are very popular on ladder because they're aggro decks and you want to get games over and done with pretty quickly. Worst matchups, Shaman, practically non-existent. Really, you don't run into them. Practically non-existent. So Warrior is in a very good spot right now. It's one of the best 3 classes. Some people would put this at number 1. I don't think it is the best deck, but I think at the moment it's about as strong as it's getting. The metagame right now is almost perfect for Warrior, and I actually do think it's one of the best decks. It's just they have so much efficient removal. And out of GVG, what they actually got, they got Shield Maiden, and they got Dr. Boom, and arguably they use Dr. Boom better than any other deck because it fits right in there. You just play 7-drop and just wham. But the actual reason why Warrior became so good was, besides Shield Maiden and Dr. Boom, which they did get, the metagame is very good for Warrior right now. Efficient minions that are supposed to trade are what Warrior is very, very good at. Why? Because you have Armorsmith, you have Cruel Taskmaster, Acolytes, you have your Deathbite, which is the single best board control weapon in the game. And beside that, you have Brawls. Some people are running 2 Brawls, which I actually thought was insane until I played against it and I realized, yeah, actually, sometimes you need 2 Brawls right now. So there's an interesting dynamic when it comes to Warrior, and they're just the most efficient control deck. They are the most efficient control deck. And we'll get to another control deck, which is actually higher up on this list, but I don't consider that, well, I kind of consider it a control deck, but it's a different way of looking at it. But anyway, on to number 2. I have got Paladin at number 2, which means probably most people can figure out what number 1 is. But anyway, Paladin has completely blown me away in terms of how powerful this deck is. I was shocked, quite frankly. I mean, we did see it on Versus Series 2 days ago. 2 days ago? 3. Yeah, 3. Anyway, we did see it on Versus Series and won every single game. But I think Paladin has a very, very interesting shift in sort of soul where it goes now. Previous to GVG, Paladin didn't exist, so I'm not even going to try and refer to that. Previous to Naxxramas, we're going pretty far back at this point. Previous to Naxxramas, Paladin had 2 archetypes. Aggro, and by aggro I mean Shockedin, as in your entire deck is 1-drops and you're on Divine Favor. Like that was how it worked in like True Silvers and Consecrate. But anyway, so there was Shockedin, and then there was Control Paladin, which was so slow that every single time in a tournament, whenever it was live and a match was taking too long, the entire chat was just joking about how it's probably Paladin versus Priest. Like, it was that slow. So there was these 2 decks. Paladin Control was the slowest deck, and therefore had a couple interesting interactions with other control decks, mainly 50-minute games. But with the amount of healing, it was very good against aggro. And then the aggro deck was very, very good at punishing some control decks, but bad against the mid-rangey decks. Now, how does this transfer into GVG? What actually happened was with the addition of Shielded Minibot, along with Coghammer, as a one-of most of the time, because then your weapons just clog, along with Muster for Battle and Quartermaster. They got a lot out of this set. And because Mech Warper wasn't as ridiculous as a lot of people thought it would be, myself included, Paladin managed to get sort of resurgence because they can deal with Mech Warper openings. It's not nice, but they can deal with it. Mostly because of how ridiculously efficient Muster for Battle and Coghammer are, along with Shielded Minibot. You can just deal with these openings. And what Quartermaster allows you to do is you have a mid-rangey deck, which can just be a pure mid-rangey deck. You can run some early game, you can run late game, you can run Lay on Hands, Tyrion, boom, as your late game. And Quartermaster fills in all the gaps. All of them. So it fills in your mid-range slot if you have board control. If you don't have board control, you run it with Muster for Battle for a massive board swing on those 2 cards, by the way. That's 3 3/3s and a 2/5. And a weapon. That's a massive board swing for 8 mana. And this comes up a lot, because games can go long. And it looks like an aggro deck, but from what I've seen, I've just been playing Paladin actually today, and also I've watched a lot of other people playing Paladin. But the weird thing about it is it's a mid-rangey deck that can fight the control decks late in the game. That's almost unheard of. Usually that's only in Mage. Why only in Mage? Because they have Duplicate. That was the only reason they could fight those control decks in that game, the Duplicate and Mirror Entity. But Paladin just has Muster for Battle and Quartermaster, and they can do exactly the same thing. They can fight the control decks in the late game, and that's why Paladin is quite powerful right now. Now, I didn't put it number 1 because I think the class number 1 is the most versatile and just the most powerful. However, Paladin I put above Warrior, and the reason for this is because Paladin is good against Warrior. That's the only reason I put it up above Warrior. What basically happens is Paladin has the Shaman effect against Warrior, which is my hero power will beat you. That's how you play the matchup. You just go, like, if you played every single guy on, what, the right? Be the right, yeah, the right hand side of the field. You'd actually just see Silverhand Recruit, small guy, Silverhand Recruit, small guy, Silverhand Recruit, small guy. That's like the entire board. Then they have to brawl it, and then you're just like, sure, dump, dump, dump. And then they have to try and board wipe it over and over and over again, and then you've got Muster for Battle into Quartermaster, and they just can't deal with that post-brawl. And you just overwhelm them. Like, completely overwhelm them. They don't even have time to play. Like, Ragnaros is useless against Paladin because of the way it works now, Muster for Battle, and the hero power basically laughs at Rag. It just shuts him down. And they just can't play their guys. The only card in Warrior Control, besides Brawl, obviously, that is actually able to fight the Paladin decks is Baron Geddon. And you can deal with the Baron Geddon and then just flood the board again. And what generally happens with Warriors, they just run out of board clears and they just die. It's the same thing against Shaman. Shaman's better at it, and the reason for it is because of Flame Tongue Totem to kill all of their win conditions when you have a board. And the utility of the totems is stronger than the 1/1s. Although it does mean that against Paladin, you can't stock armor because the 1/1s kill it. Whereas against Shaman, they just don't care about your armor. And the other thing is Hex. Hex really does shut down Warrior Control a lot. But Paladin is not as good against Warrior Shaman, but we're comparing a 95 to 5% matchup to something like probably about 70-30. It's still relevant, and it's the reason I put Paladin above Warrior. Anyway, on to number 1. As I said, most people can probably figure this out through a process of elimination. Warlock. Mr. Gul'dan the Warlock, who has been one of the strongest classes about as long as anyone can remember. Why? Because the hero power is kind of overpowered. But anyway, I've talked about this at length in the past, so I'm not going to. But basically, Warlock I put number 1 because they have 2 strong archetypes. Zoo with Implosion and Sea Giant actually got very, very high in Legend. It's ridiculous. It got to number 1. I think Xixo was playing it. I think. Don't quote me on that because it's probably wrong. But anyway, there was a Sea Giant and Implosion deck. Just completely ran over everyone. And then on the other side of things, you got Handlock. The deck which people are so scared of, they will ban on sight. Yes, Handlock is a control deck. However, the reason I said Warrior is the best pure control deck is because Handlock is not a control deck when it actually plays. Yes, it controls the board, but it controls the board by threatening to kill you in 2 turns. Over and over and over again with giants. I mean, it's technically 3 turns, but the point is it adds up. You just go giant, giant, swing, swing, swing. That's basically what happens when, as soon as the Handlock controls the board, they just kill you with 8/8s. So it's more of a beat down control deck as opposed to just go to control the board, get some win conditions, go. That kind of game only really gets approached in the control mirror matches because that's where they have Jiraxis and sometimes Alexstrasza and things like that to actually beat down on those control decks. Because Moltens don't come into the equation as much. However, in most games that are not against control decks, it does turn into a more beat-down deck that you actually, weirdly enough, unless you're a really fast aggro deck, you have to have a way of answering the giants. Because they just play giants and then they stop your attack. So you have to have a way of answering the giants. It makes Handlock incredibly good right now. The other thing is access to Siphon Soul is really important. But one way of putting this is that Handlock, I think, is one of the best decks in the format right now, where everyone is playing Big Game Hunter because of Dr. Boom. Almost every single deck, apart from Zoo, has Big Game Hunter in it. That's actually pretty ridiculous that everyone has Big Game Hunter and Handlock is still very good. And then on the other side of the spectrum, you've got Zoo, which makes Warlock probably the best class in tournament play, and also the most likely banned class in tournament play, because traditionally, and it still works now, you don't really know what you're playing against. Now, the Pinnacle has actually been on over the past couple days, and in that deck, I mean, not in that deck, in that tournament, they had this weird system where it was like you could ban things out by immediately winning a game as soon as you saw the matchup. And because it was a successive tournament, you knew what kind of deck they were playing, and people were still getting rid of Warlock, even though they knew exactly what it was and exactly what to throw into it. So, I do think Warlock is the strongest deck right now. I think the margin is incredibly small, though. Like, as I said, the top 3 are incredibly close together. Arguably, the top 4 are incredibly close together. And then Priest can be better than all of them if piloted by the correct person. So, that kind of shows just how well balanced this particular metagame is. We don't have this crazy, oh, Hunter is killing everything metagame that we had in Naxxramas, so I'm pretty happy with how the metagame is right now. As for the other classes, Rogue has that crazy tempo deck, which is doing pretty well right now. Then there's the Hunter Rush decks, which are also working. Weirdly enough, Hunter's gone back to its roots, which is back to those like ridiculous face rush aggro decks. It's actually the kind of decks that I was playing in a lot. I played 450 games of that deck. Although they're not playing tracking anymore, which means I don't like the deck as much, because it means it's not as skill intensive. And yeah, tracking is the most skill intensive card in the game, but I haven't seen that many trackings recently. They're probably still running them. But as for Shaman is in a weird place right now. I think the decks it can make are good enough, but they're not mind-boggling. They're not like really powerful. They're just kind of okay. It kind of reminds me of Paladin. Actually, no, nowhere near. Nowhere near as bad as Paladin was in Naxxramas. But it kind of reminds me of Priest before... It kind of reminds me of Priest like just after Naxxramas, where they had Cultist and the deck was strong. It wasn't like ridiculously good, but it was strong, just not strong enough to really compete. And that's kind of where Shaman is right now. But anyway, thank you all for watching. If you like the content, please subscribe. If you have any feedback, put it in the comment section below. But as for now, this has been Jotto, signing off.